Welcome to Detective Duo, where classic mysteries come alive, from quiet villages to secret meetings with Tommy and Tuppence themselves. Do remember to subscribe and tell us in the comments where you're listening from tonight. Tuppence Beresford had declared war before breakfast. It was not a large war, nor a particularly noble one, but it was the kind fought in drawing rooms and offices across Britain, a battle against a drawer that insisted on being everything at once. The agency's notorious miscellaneous drawer occupied the left side of the oak desk, like a bad conscience, swollen with years of benign neglect. Tommy had long ago made peace with it. Tuppence had not. This, she announced, brandishing a snapped pencil like a forensic exhibit, is how civilizations collapse, not with bombs, Tommy, with miscellany. Tommy, who was attempting to butter toast without appearing to take sides, murmured something vague about entropy and the natural drift of objects toward chaos. It earned him a glare. Entropy is no excuse, Tuppence declared. This drawer is an offence to order, possibly also to morality. With that, she plunged both hands inside. Papers rustled. A keychain clinked. Something rolled ominously to the back. Tommy retreated to the safer territory of making tea. The excavation continued with archaeological seriousness. Old case notes, stubs of theatre tickets, a half-melted wax seal, 3 buttons that, as far as Tommy knew, matched no garment they owned. Then Tuppence froze. What on earth is this? She withdrew a small velvet ring box, deep green, the pile worn smooth at the corners. It looked misplaced, too elegant to share space with rubber bands and expired train timetables. Tommy drifted back toward her, curiosity winning over self-preservation. Inside lay a man's gold wedding band, plain but unmistakably old. The inscription etched inside caught the light. A.M. to my one true friend. Tuppence inhaled sharply. Well, that's not the sort of thing one forgets they own. Not ours, Tommy said. Not anyone we know either. And absolutely not something that belongs in a miscellaneous drawer. She snapped it shut as though afraid it might whisper secrets. Tommy, someone put this here. Tommy opened his mouth to protest the logic of attributing criminal cunning to a ring in a drawer, but a knock at the office door cut him off. Sharp, precise, no nonsense. Tuppence brightened at once. Saved by the bell, Tommy muttered. Mrs. Gertrude Larkin entered with the air of a woman who had no patience for dithering. She was brisk, silver-haired, and wore an expression that suggested she corrected grammar in her head as people spoke. Mr. and Mrs. Beresford, she said without preamble, settling into the chair opposite them. I require assistance. Someone has been coming into my home at night. Tuppence leaned forward. Coming in? What do they take? That, Mrs. Larkin replied, is the peculiar part. Nothing. Not so much as a teaspoon. They simply alter things. Alter? Tommy echoed. Shift. Rearrange. Move. Objects that have no earthly reason to change position. My late husband's desk drawers opened. A book angled differently, a needlework frame turned by several inches. I may be old, Mr. Beresford, but I am not fanciful. Tuppence exchanged a glance with Tommy, the bright, dangerous sort of glance that meant she was already invested. Mrs. Larkin then produced her own unsettling item, a pressed flower sealed in a glass oval, the sort one might expect inside a sentimental locket. Only this one had been left on her kitchen table after one of the intrusions. Tuppence reached for it gently. This was placed deliberately. Exactly, Mrs. Larkin said. Someone is toying with my memories. Tommy opened his notebook, though his expression still hovered between sympathetic concern and a private hope the whole matter could be solved by a loose window latch. Have you seen anyone near your home? He asked. No. Whoever it is comes quietly, with familiarity. Mrs. Larkin hesitated. My stepdaughter thinks me fanciful, but she has always believed I meddled too much in her father's life. Tuppence's instincts sharpened. A family tension was always good for business. And these rearrangements, Tommy said gently. How long have they been happening? 2 months. Mrs. Larkin folded her hands tightly. At first I doubted myself, but once this appeared, she gestured to the pressed flower, I knew someone meant me to notice. Tuppence sat straighter. We'll take your case. Tommy turned so abruptly he nearly spilled the inkwell. We what? "Of course you will," Mrs. Larkin said, satisfied. "You come highly recommended." Tommy made a mental note to locate whoever was recommending them for nocturnal memory-related disturbances and kindly ask them to stop. Mrs. Larkin left soon after, lighter for having unburdened herself, though no less troubled. When the door clicked shut, Tuppence lifted the velvet ring box again. "Tommy, doesn't it seem odd? A mysterious wedding band appears the same morning a client arrives with a mysterious intruder." Tommy sighed. "It's called coincidence." Tuppence looked at him as though he had suggested gravity was optional. "There is no such thing. Someone wants our attention." "And I suppose the ring spoke to you, did it?" It whispered intrigue. They prepared to lock up. Tuppence, without ceremony, slipped the ring box into her handbag. "I thought we were returning that to the drawer." "And risk losing it again? Absolutely not." Tommy shook his head, but something in his chest tightened, an unease that had nothing to do with tidiness and everything to do with the quiet, deliberate nature of both mysteries now unfolding. As they stepped out onto the pavement, pulling the office door shut behind them, Tommy cast one last glance at Tuppence's handbag. He had the distinct, unwelcome feeling that this harmless inquiry might stir up far more than dust and nostalgia. Tuppence had always believed you could tell everything about a person by their front garden. Mrs. Gertrude Larkin's was arranged with the kind of precise symmetry that suggested either deep serenity or deep nerves. The roses stood in regimented rows, the gravel was combed into obedient ripples, and even the milk bottles by the doorstep were aligned like soldiers awaiting inspection. Tuppence murmured a low whistle. "Either she's wonderfully organized," she said, "or absolutely terrified of chaos." Tommy grimaced. "Let's pray it's the former. After that drawer of yours yesterday, I've had my fill of domestic tension." Mrs. Larkin opened the door before they knocked, as though she had been waiting behind it with the poise of a stage cue. She ushered them inside with crisp politeness. The cottage interior matched the exterior's obsessive order. Every object had a designated position, and every surface gleamed with the sort of shine that spoke of regular polishing. "I'm not losing my mind," she announced before either of them sat down. Someone is entering my home." Tuppence lowered herself onto a straight-back chair. "Show us." Mrs. Larkin led them to a small study at the rear of the cottage. The room smelled faintly of lavender furniture polish and something older. Paper, dust, the stubborn residue of a man who had lived a long, structured life. Arthur Larkin's desk stood near the window. Its drawers were closed, but Mrs. Larkin opened each one with brisk, almost ceremonial movements. "These letters," she said, indicating a stack tied with blue ribbon, "were inside the second drawer. They are now in the first. These books, look here, this volume was turned outward when I left it facing inward, and my husband's pen set was rearranged. I did not touch them." Tommy leaned over the desk, frowning. "Nothing missing?" "Nothing," she said flatly. "That is what unnerves me." Tuppence moved around the room with a kind of feline calm. She observed each detail, the framed photograph slightly crooked on the wall, the faint scuff mark on the wooden floor, the subtle misalignment of a chair leg on the polished rug. Tiny things, insignificant alone, together, troubling. "How often has this happened?" Tuppence asked. "A dozen times, always at night. I wake to find objects shifted." Mrs. Larkin paused, then went to a side table and lifted a small envelope. "And then there are these." Inside were postcards, each bearing a brief, sharp message, written in restrained, elegant handwriting. "Don't forget me. You still owe the truth. Nothing stays buried." Tommy read them slowly. "No signature, no address." "No postmark either," Mrs. Larkin said. "They are left on my kitchen table, as though my intruder wants me to find them." Tuppence exchanged a glance with Tommy. This was no ordinary nuisance caller or mischievous neighbour. Someone meant to unsettle the widow intentionally, intimately. "May we look around the house?" Tuppence asked. Mrs. Larkin nodded and retreated to the living room, leaving them free to investigate. Tuppence moved with quiet precision. She paused beside the hallway table, where an old family portrait hung slightly askew. Someone had handled it recently. Further along, the polished floorboards near the back door bore a faint smear, almost invisible to an untrained eye, but Tuppence caught the trace of something else. Cologne. A scent she did not recognize. Tommy stepped outside to question the neighbours. Most had nothing to offer beyond polite concern, but one, Mrs. Culpepper, a woman with a canary yellow cardigan and the nosiness of a village bulletin board, was delighted to supply opinions. "That stepdaughter of hers," Mrs. Culpepper began, leaning over her gate, "comes around less often now. There's tension, you see. Always was. Anne never approved of her father remarrying. Says Mrs. Larkin meddled in everything, the will, the letters, his possessions." "Do they argue?" Tommy asked. Mrs. Culpepper lifted her chin. "Not loudly. The quiet kind of disagreements. The dangerous kind, if you ask me." Tommy thanked her and returned to the cottage. He found Tuppence in the bedroom examining a small wooden jewellery box. "Notice anything odd?" she whispered. "Yes. Mrs. Culpepper knows everyone's sins." Tuppence shot him a look. "Be serious. Look." Inside the jewellery box sat several trinkets neatly arranged, but one object, a ring-shaped indentation lined with velvet, was empty. "She kept her husband's old ring here," Tuppence said softly. "She mentioned it during tea, said she'd never parted with it." "Maybe she moved it elsewhere," Tommy offered. "No, she's not the sort who misplaces things." Tuppence tapped the empty space. "And guess what shape this indentation is? Exactly the size of the ring we found in our drawer." Tommy's eyebrows rose. "Coincidence?" Tuppence gave him a patient, pitying look reserved for husbands who persisted in being foolish. "No such thing." Mrs. Larkin returned to the doorway. "Find something?" Tuppence closed the box gently. "Just looking. May we see the garden?" Mrs. Larkin nodded, though her eyes flicked to the jewellery box with a flash of unease. Outside, the back porch carried the same faint cologne scent. Tuppence inhaled, committing it to memory. Not floral, not common. Something sharper, more masculine, with a hint of cedar. "Someone stood here recently," she murmured. Tommy folded his arms. "So we have shifting objects, silent intrusions, cryptic messages, and now a missing ring that somehow found its way into our drawer." Tuppence's expression grew thoughtful. "It feels orchestrated." "By whom?" "That is the question." She brushed a hand along the porch rail. "But whoever they are, they know this house intimately, and they know us." As they prepared to leave, Mrs. Larkin walked them to the front door. Her composure was steady, but Tuppence detected the tremor beneath it. "Do you think I'm imagining it?" Mrs. Larkin asked quietly. Tuppence reached out and touched her hand. "No, something is happening here, and we will find out what." Mrs. Larkin nodded gratefully. Outside, as they walked toward the gate, Tuppence murmured, "Tommy, the threads are crossing too soon." Tommy sighed. "Which means someone wants us to start pulling on them." Tuppence glanced back at the immaculate cottage, at the perfect gravel and the regimented roses. Something disturbingly deliberate threaded through the quiet calm of Ealing. "Tommy," she said softly, "this isn't the work of a prankster." He nodded. "No, this feels personal. And carefully staged. Which is worse," Tommy added. They walked away with identical thoughts but did not voice them yet. Someone had begun rearranging Mrs. Larkin's past, and now someone had reached into the Beresfords' present. Tuppence had barely closed the office door behind them before she was marching straight toward the agency files with the determined stride of a general who had decided the war was winnable after all. Tommy, resigned to a long morning of paper rustling and Tuppence's theories delivered in rapid-fire succession, hung up his coat and followed her inside. The ring box lay in the centre of the desk, like a stage prop awaiting its cue. Tuppence opened it again, studied the engraving, and shut it with a snap that suggested the universe was being slow to reveal its intended meaning. "Right," she said briskly. "Let's see what ghosts we've forgotten." Tommy took the opposite chair and opened the first ledger. They spent a quiet half-hour combing through the agency's meticulously kept client index, names, case notes, expenses, yet there was no Arthur Larkin, no Mrs. Larkin, no AM, and certainly no case involving a wedding band or discrete sentimental objects. "This is odd," Tommy said finally. "That," Tuppence replied, "is the understatement of the year. Someone placed that ring where I'd find it. People don't plant wedding bands in random drawers unless they want attention." Tommy leaned back. "There is the possibility." "There is never the possibility of coincidence," Tuppence cut in. "Not with us, not with mysteries." Before Tommy could protest, there came a knock, single, sharp, and decidedly unwelcome. Tuppence stiffened. She could always tell when the person on the other side of a door was going to be trouble. She opened it with the polite smile she reserved for tax collectors, difficult clients, and people who asked too many questions about her age. Anne Larkin swept inside. She was elegant in the cool, composed way of someone who disapproved of clutter, noise, frivolity, and possibly oxygen. A tailored navy coat, gloves she didn't remove, and an expression that seemed carved rather than worn. She inspected the agency with the kind of tight-lipped disdain usually reserved for questionable wallpaper. "I thought I should come," she said, "before my stepmother wastes any more of your time." Tommy blinked. Mrs. Larkin's concerns are fantasies, Anne said crisply. She has been overwrought for months, lonely, unsettled. She imagines things, doors she thinks she closed, books she believes she placed differently. I assure you she is perfectly safe. Tuppence folded her arms. She showed us a pressed flower left on her kitchen table. She didn't place it there. Anne's smile was thin. My stepmother keeps dozens of little sentimental trinkets. She forgets where she puts them. Tommy studied her with mild interest. Anne, despite her elegance, looked frayed at the edges, a tension around the eyes, a subtle tapping of her right heel on the wooden floor. She was nervous about something, nervous enough to come uninvited. Tuppence didn't bother hiding her suspicion. "Mrs. Larkin also mentioned tension between you." Anne's jaw tightened. "She meddled in my father's life. She meddles still, but that's family business." "Everything becomes detective business if it wanders through our door," Tuppence said pleasantly. Anne's gaze snapped to the desk, specifically to the velvet ring box lying open. "That," she said abruptly, "is not yours." Tommy raised an eyebrow. "You recognize it?" Anne hesitated. Only a fraction of a second, but enough for Tuppence to pounce mentally. Anne Larkin's eyes had widened ever so slightly at the sight of the engraving. "No," Anne said too quickly. "No, I've never seen it. I simply meant it doesn't look like your sort of thing." Tuppence shut the box with deliberate slowness. "Indeed." The silence between the three of them tightened, strained, stretched thin like a wire. Anne rose. "Leave my stepmother's worries alone, Mrs. Beresford. They are not for outsiders. You'll only encourage her delusions." Tuppence smiled with lethal sweetness. "We'll decide that for ourselves." Anne's expression flickered, something like contempt or perhaps fear, before she turned and exited with a crispness that made the office feel warmer in her absence. Tommy exhaled. "Pleasant woman?" "She recognized the ring," Tuppence said immediately. "She denied it." "She recognized it," Tuppence insisted. "A person doesn't stare at a ring like that unless they know something." Tommy opened his mouth, closed it, then rubbed his temples. "Tuppence, I have something to admit." "Good heavens, is it scandalous?" "I felt watched," Tommy said quietly. "Yesterday, on my walk home, not followed, watched, like someone stood still somewhere and took note of every step." Tuppence lowered herself into her chair. The levity evaporated. "Why didn't you tell me?" "I wasn't sure, and I wasn't going to worry you over nothing." "Nothing?" She gestured to the ring box. "Overplanted jewellery, cryptic postcards, an unsettled widow, and a stepdaughter who looks ready to bite something." "Fine," Tommy conceded. "Not nothing." They worked in silence after that, each turning over the morning's encounters within their own thoughts. Tommy made a fresh pot of tea. Tuppence examined the engraving again, tracing the curve of each letter with her thumb. "A token of friendship," she murmured. "Not love. Why engrave it on a wedding band? And who is A.M.?" Tommy shrugged. "Perhaps we'll know when someone decides to stop leaving mysteries and start leaving answers." But Tuppence was no longer listening. Something in her gaze had shifted, from curiosity to calculation. Night settled over the neighbourhood before either noticed the time. Tommy closed the blinds. Tuppence locked the filing cabinet. They stepped out into the cool air, their minds still full of Mrs. Larkin's tremor, Anne's hostility, and the quiet threat coiled within the little gold ring. Later, at home, Tuppence sat in the dim sitting room, legs curled under her, studying the ring by lamplight. Tommy had gone to bed, though not convincingly. She heard him open the bedroom door once, checking on the creak she'd made. The inscription gleamed faintly. A.M. to my one true friend. A declaration of loyalty, a confession, or a reminder to someone who had forgotten. The clock on the mantel ticked steadily. At midnight, a sharp knock shattered the quiet. Tuppence froze. The knock came again, quicker, almost urgent, then silence. Total, absolute silence, as though the night itself held its breath. She hurried to the door. Tommy, already awake, met her in the hallway, hair dishevelled, eyes alert. "Did you?" "Yes," she swallowed. "Open it." Tommy pulled the door wide. The street outside was empty. No footsteps retreating, no shadows slipping away. Nothing disturbed, except for one object placed neatly on the doorstep. A white postcard. Tommy bent, lifted it carefully and read aloud. "You will choose a side soon." Tuppence's breath caught. This was no longer a case, no longer curiosity, no longer a harmless inquiry. Someone had drawn a line, and they had been invited or compelled to step across it. The mystery had become personal. And Tuppence Beresford never walked away from personal. Tuppence believed that silence, when used deliberately, could be as revealing as any confession. It was this conviction that shaped her posture the next morning as she and Tommy approached Mrs. Larkin's cottage once more. The street was quiet, the sort of respectable suburban lane where curtains were washed weekly and neighbours observed one another's routines like budding anthropologists. Yet Tuppence sensed a tremor beneath the tranquillity, something faint but persistent, like the vibration of a distant engine. Mrs. Larkin answered the door before they knocked, as though she had been waiting just behind it. Her expression was tight, polite, and faintly resigned, as if she suspected the Beresfords had not returned merely to inquire about her well-being. She ushered them to the sitting room, a neat, overly symmetrical space where nothing seemed allowed to rest at anything but a perfect right angle. Tommy began amiably. "We hope to clarify a few small points, Mrs. Larkin. Purely routine." She folded her hands in her lap. Routine rarely arrives with such persistence. Tuppence smiled gently. "You mentioned your late husband, Arthur. We're hoping to better understand the context of these disturbances." For the first time, something flickered across the widow's face. Wariness, or perhaps regret. "Arthur Larkin," she said slowly, "was a man who valued propriety. He worked hard at the ministry for more years than he wished to admit. He was respected, not warm perhaps, but reliable. His first marriage failed, though not for lack of trying. Anne never forgave him for remarrying." "Did he have enemies?" Tommy asked. "Not enemies. People can dislike without being dangerous." Her answer was brisk, but her gaze drifted toward the mantelpiece where a small framed photograph of Arthur stood alone. "My husband was not a man given to passion." Tuppence sensed the clipped edge of her words. "Mrs. Larkin, when we searched his study, there were signs someone had been in there before us. Drawers slightly out of alignment, papers shifted." Mrs. Larkin stiffened. "I told you someone has been entering my home. I may be old, but I'm not blind." "And the ring," Tuppence said with practiced softness. "The wedding band engraved with A.M. It wasn't in the study." Mrs. Larkin's breath caught. "Arthur never wore that ring." "But it belonged to him?" Tommy pressed. Mrs. Larkin looked away. "It belonged to someone he admired greatly, a friend from long ago. I have no desire to revisit that chapter." Her tone shut like a snapped book. "I'm tired, Mrs. Beresford. These questions are exhausting." She rose, signalling the end of the visit. Tuppence nodded, letting the moment pass rather than force it. Sometimes the walls people built were more informative than the truths behind them. Outside, the street felt cooler. Tommy exhaled. "She's hiding something." "She's hiding grief," Tuppence corrected, "which is not the same thing, but she knows more about that ring than she intends to say." Tommy paced slowly along the pavement. "I still think we're circling shadows. A lonely woman, unsettled memories, a house full of too much order." "Don't," Tuppence stopped him with a raised hand. "Don't turn this into one of your practical Tommy explanations. A man doesn't admire someone enough to keep their ring unless there's weight behind it, and Mrs. Larkin is terrified of the weight." As Tommy opened his mouth to respond, Tuppence's gaze snapped to the other side of the street. A tall figure stood partially behind a lamppost, a man in a long grey coat, broad-shouldered, with his head slightly bowed. His face was shadowed, but the posture was unmistakably that of someone watching. "Tommy," she murmured. But the moment the man realized he'd been seen, he moved. Not hurriedly, not clumsily, but with uncanny smoothness, stepping away from the lamppost and vanishing between two houses as though swallowed by the quiet suburban geometry. Tommy rushed across the road, but when he reached the spot, the stranger had disappeared entirely. No retreating footsteps, no creaking gait, not even the swish of a coat against brick. He returned to Tuppence, shaken. "All right, that wasn't imagination." "He was observing us," Tuppence said, "not Mrs. Larkin. Us." The significance hung between them, tightening the air. They remained outside a while longer, debating theories that seemed less stable with each passing minute. Tommy wondered whether the stranger was connected to Anne. Tuppence suspected the opposite, that he was tied somehow to Arthur Larkin's past, to the ring, to the strange admiration Mrs. Larkin wished not to discuss. When they finally returned to the cottage to speak with a neighbour, they found Mrs. Pennington, plump, rosy-cheeked and delightfully opinionated, sweeping her front step. Upon hearing that they were investigating Mrs. Larkin's disturbances, she clucked her tongue approvingly. "About time someone looked into it," she said. "Between you and me, Arthur's daughter never much liked her father's second wife. Always said Mrs. Larkin was trying to erase the past." "Erase?" Tuppence echoed. "Oh, yes. Anne was always very dramatic. Claimed her father was becoming a stranger in his own home. Some daughters never leave childhood grievances behind." "Would Anne have any reason to frighten her stepmother?" Tommy asked. Mrs. Pennington lowered her voice conspiratorially. "Anne Larkin has reasons for all sorts of things. Her father's will didn't leave her nearly enough, if you ask me. But whether she's behind the postcards, I can't say. She's a cold one." Tuppence filed every word away, though instinct told her Anne was a complication, not the architect. As they stepped through the front gate, the neighbour called after them. "There was one more thing. My grandson found a bit of paper in my back garden this morning. Blew in from Mrs. Larkin's side, I think." She handed Tuppence a torn scrap, brittle at the edges. Only part of a sentence remained. "Won't let the truth die with you." The handwriting matched the looping, deliberate style of the cryptic postcards. Tommy frowned deeply. "Someone's escalating." "And they're writing like a person with a score to settle," Tuppence said. The day dimmed slightly as they walked toward the station, though neither noticed the change in light. Their conversation was brisk, rapid fire, layered with conjecture and doubt. "I don't like this direction," Tommy admitted. "This is no longer about harmless rearrangements or sentimental messages. Someone is exerting pressure, controlled pressure." "That's precisely why it's becoming interesting," Tuppence replied. "Interesting," Tommy said sharply, "is not my preferred word when anonymous men stare at us from street corners." For a moment, they walked in taut silence. Then Tuppence softened. "Tommy, every case reaches a point where the threads pull tight. This is ours. Someone is pushing Mrs. Larkin because they want something revealed, something connected to Arthur, to the ring, to the past she refuses to discuss." "And the Watcher?" Tommy asked. "He's either guiding us or warning us, possibly both." They reached the platform. A train shrieked in the distance, a hollow metallic cry that felt strangely fitting. The mystery no longer belonged solely inside Mrs. Larkin's cottage. It had expanded, taken shape, begun to breathe. Tommy rubbed the back of his neck. "I just hope we're not stepping into something we can't step out of." Tuppence's smile was thin but certain. "Pressure reveals the cracks, Tommy." And the cracks, she thought, were finally beginning to show. On their next visit to Arthur Larkin's study, the first thing Tuppence noticed was the silence. Not the ordinary hush of a quiet room, but a taut, almost suspended stillness, the kind that suggested secrets packed so tightly into its walls that they barely dared to breathe. The space was narrow, nearly austere, its shelves lined with orderly rows of books and neatly stacked papers. Nothing was out of place, and yet everything felt faintly wrong, as though it had been arranged by someone who wanted to appear meticulous rather than someone who naturally was. "Well," Tommy murmured, surveying the room with a sceptical lift of his brow, "if this is anyone's idea of chaos, I'd love to see their definition of messy." Tuppence didn't smile. She hovered near the first shelf, her gaze landing on a single volume pulled outward by the faintest fraction of an inch. "It isn't chaos," she said. "It's too careful, and care can be suspicious." Tommy sighed softly. "Everything is suspicious to you these days." "Only the things that are." She plucked the book from the shelf, examining it thoughtfully before slipping it back into place. The sound of it sliding flush with the others seemed almost too loud. Mrs. Larkin, waiting at the doorway, wrung her hands apologetically. "I don't know what you expect to find," she said. "Arthur kept everything precise. He liked order. He always said a tidy room makes for a tidy mind." "Yes, well, someone else has been tidying along the way," Tuppence replied gently. "We're simply seeing what their fingers touched." Tommy approached the desk, a solid, dark piece with brass knobs polished to a muted shine. He tugged at the top drawer and felt a faint resistance before it gave way. Inside lay an arrangement so perfect it felt unnatural. Letters stacked, envelopes aligned, pens arranged like soldiers before inspection. "Doesn't look disturbed," he said. "Look closer," Tuppence replied. She took the drawer from him and lifted it into the light. There, a small scratch on the lock's metal edge, barely noticeable. The kind of mark left by someone who tried to open it without a key and hoped no one would ever notice. "Someone's been trying things," she murmured. Mrs. Larkin pressed a hand to her chest. "Oh dear, I hardly dare imagine why." Tuppence didn't answer. Her attention had drifted to a stack of correspondence resting beneath the blotter. A discreet little bundle bound with an ordinary piece of twine, yet its anonymity made it stand out. She slid it free and untied it carefully. Inside were letters, dozens of them, from men whose names she did not recognize. Expressions of gratitude, polite and earnest, lines thanking Arthur Larkin for his quiet assistance, for your generosity that came when nothing else did, for offering hope when the world had none left. Tommy leaned over her shoulder, reading snatches. "This wasn't a hobby," he said quietly. "He was running some sort of fund." "A discreet one," Tuppence murmured, "much like the pressed flower left on Mrs. Larkin's table, something that hides in plain sight." Her fingers paused on the signature of one particular letter. The initials were simple, inconspicuous, yet they leapt out at her with cold clarity. "A.M." Tommy caught her expression. "As in the ring?" "As in the ring," she confirmed. "Arthur Larkin had a friend, or perhaps a benefactor, or perhaps someone he failed." Before she could ponder further, her hand brushed something beneath the letter stack, a slight unevenness in the surface of the desk. She tapped the area, then pressed lightly. A tiny segment of wood shifted, revealing a concealed panel no larger than her palm. "Well," Tommy whispered, "hidden compartments. That's always encouraging." Inside lay a small photograph, faded with age. Two men in uniform, their arms slung over each other's shoulders in easy camaraderie. One was unmistakably Arthur Larkin, younger, smiling a rare, unburdened smile. The other man's face, however, had been marred, not by accident of age or moisture, but by intent. A dark smear of burned paper tore through the features, obliterating identity. The destruction was deliberate. Tuppence stared at it, dread thickening in her stomach. Someone didn't want this man recognized. Mrs. Larkin stepped forward, her voice trembling. "Where did you find that?" "In Arthur's desk," Tuppence said, closing the panel gently. "Did he ever speak of close friends from his service days?" Mrs. Larkin hesitated. The pause said far more than her eventual murmur. "He mentioned someone once, a man who meant a great deal to him, but I gathered it was complicated. Arthur was not a man to share easily." Tuppence eyed the desk. He wanted this hidden, but someone else wanted it found. A sudden thump echoed from the hallway, muffled but unmistakable. Then the creak of a floorboard. Tommy stiffened. "Someone's here," he whispered. Mrs. Larkin gasped, pressing herself against the doorway. Tuppence lifted a hand for silence. She moved to the edge of the study door, every sense focused. A shadow slid across the light sliver beneath the frame. Slow, unhurried. Whoever it was moved with confidence, not the furtive uncertainty of a burglar. Tommy snatched up a brass paperweight, holding it in a manner that suggested he hoped very much not to use it. The shadow paused. Then the doorknob turned. Tuppence inhaled, steady, calm, ready. The door swung open, and Anne Larkin swept in, her expression thunderous. "What," she demanded, voice sharp as a blade, "do you think you're doing?" Mrs. Larkin sagged with relief. Tommy lowered the paperweight at once, but Tuppence did not relax. "We are conducting an investigation," she said coolly, "one your stepmother requested." Anne's eyes flashed. "She had no right. This is private property, and you are going through my father's belongings like common thieves." Tommy spoke quietly. "Nothing is being taken. We're simply looking for answers." "Then look elsewhere." Anne moved toward the desk, her footsteps quick, agitated. "You have no idea the damage you could do rummaging through things you don't understand." Tuppence met her gaze unwaveringly. "Then perhaps you could explain, starting with why you never mentioned your father's charity work." Anne faltered. It was slight, a small tightening around the mouth, a momentary drop of her eyes, but Tuppence saw it. "My father was a private man," Anne said stiffly. "He didn't bandy his affairs about for strangers." "And his friend?" Tuppence asked softly. "A.M. Who was he?" "I don't know. Too quick, too brittle." "Then why," Tuppence continued, even quieter, "did you react when you saw the ring?" Anne's silence was an answer of its own. For several moments the room held nothing but the low hum of unresolved tension. Anne's glare burned with hostility, but beneath it simmered something far more brittle: fear. Finally she spun on her heel. "This inquiry ends today. I won't have you stirring up ghosts." She strode away before anyone could reply, her footsteps echoing sharply down the hallway. Tommy exhaled slowly. "Well, that went marvellously." Tuppence looked once more at the photograph, Arthur smiling beside a friend whose face someone had fought to erase. "No," she murmured. "It went exactly as it needed to." For the truth, long buried, had begun to shift, and the house, with its perfect order and perfect silence, had finally betrayed where its loyalties lay. Tommy Beresford had never much cared for government buildings, and the ministry archives reminded him precisely why. The air inside felt heavy with dust and bureaucracy, as though every letter ever written since the Boer War had been stacked somewhere just out of sight, exhaling stale sighs while clerks scurried beneath them like anxious beetles. He showed his identification to a young man who looked as though he'd been powdered with chalk and was ushered into a reading room filled with rows of narrow desks and the faint scratch of pens. Somewhere among these files lay A.M. The initials glinted in Tommy's mind like a half-buried rivet. Tuppence was convinced the ring had been planted deliberately. Tommy had begun to agree. No one mislaid a wedding band engraved with a message of devotion to a true friend unless it had weight, emotional or otherwise. An elderly archivist shuffled to him, carrying a box that seemed as though it might crumble under its own history. "Military personnel, Larkin, Arthur," she announced, "and related correspondence." "Related?" Tommy asked. "There were searches logged, requests, oddly placed. I thought you might want to see the whole of it." Tommy thanked her, sitting down as the files released their faint papery scent. The documents were neat, typed, orderly. Arthur Larkin appeared to have run his professional life with precision. But between the expected records, Tommy found scattered anomalies, repeated references to an Andrew Marsden, noted as presumed dead in an explosion. Yet Arthur had filed not one but 3 inquiries asking for updates on the man's condition or whereabouts. The most recent had been filed just months before Arthur's own passing. Tommy leaned back. A dead man should not be searched for repeatedly, not unless someone doubted the death. And Arthur Larkin, conservative in temperament, did not strike Tommy as the sort to harbour private doubts without reason. Meanwhile, across London, Tuppence Beresford was conducting an investigation of her own, one with far more tea, more chatter, and considerably more psychological manoeuvring. She sat in the cosy kitchen of Mrs. Wyndham, an acquaintance of Mrs. Larkin from the early days of her second marriage. A kettle steamed on the stove, the room smelled faintly of sponge cake and age-polished wood. "Oh, Arthur was a fine gentleman," Mrs. Wyndham said, pouring Tuppence a cup of tea that threatened to slosh over the rim. "But terribly private, always receiving letters from one particular fellow. I remember because Arthur's face would light up when he saw the handwriting. Called him his truest friend, he did, though I can't say the stepdaughter approved." "Anne disliked him?" Tuppence prompted. "She disliked anyone who reminded her of her father's life before she could control it." Mrs. Wyndham sniffed. "She said the friend was a bad influence, something about driving a wedge between her and her father. I never saw any such thing. Arthur always spoke of him with fondness. Tuppence stirred her tea idly. Do you recall the friend's name? Mrs. Wyndham frowned. Only the initials. A.M. Something Marsden or Marston? It's been so many years. Tuppence's fingers tightened around the teaspoon. And did you ever meet him? Never. But those letters came regularly, that much I know. Until suddenly they didn't. A silence settled between them. Tuppence allowed it to sit just long enough for weight before she asked, Do you know if anyone else might have seen these letters? Oh, that cafe man on the corner, Mrs. Wyndham said, waving a hand. He saw Arthur picking up post there sometimes. They had an arrangement, something discreet. Discreet. The word clicked perfectly into place. By late afternoon, Tommy returned from the archives to the agency office where Tuppence was already waiting, perched on the corner of the desk, arms folded, eyes bright with sharpened curiosity. Well? She asked. Tommy dropped the file box beside her. A.M. is very likely Andrew Marsden, veteran, presumed dead in an explosion, no known family, a quiet record, but Arthur searched for him repeatedly toward the end. And listen to this, Tuppence countered, hopping down. Mrs. Wyndham remembers Arthur receiving letters from a man he called his truest friend. Marsden again. Tommy raised an eyebrow. Truest friend. That matches the engraving. And then there's this bit, Tuppence continued, pacing now. A cafe owner near Mrs. Wyndham's house remembers a man in a grey coat asking questions about us, whether we were discreet, whether we were clever. Tommy's spine tightened. The Watcher. Precisely. If Marsden survived, Tommy murmured, then everything begins to make sense. The ring, the postcards, the rearrangements in Mrs. Larkin's home. And someone else trying desperately to shut it all down, Tuppence finished. For a moment, they stood in the quiet office. Two bright minds tracing converging lines of truth that suddenly felt too deliberate, too orchestrated. That evening, as dusk softened the outlines of the furniture and cast long shadows across their sitting room, Tommy found himself unusually tense. The kettle sang on the hob, the clock ticked, yet something felt wrong, displaced. Tuppence sat on the sofa, the ring box between her fingertips, turning it slowly like a puzzle piece that refused to fit. Tommy, she said softly, do you ever wonder if our cases choose us instead of the other way around? He sat beside her. I wonder if we've let curiosity drag us into something better left untouched. She looked sharply at him. You think we're being manipulated? I think, Tommy said carefully, that someone is steering us, feeding us just enough breadcrumbs to ensure we follow. And you think I'm too eager to follow breadcrumbs? I didn't say that. You didn't have to. A rare silence fell between them, one edged not by anger but by a subtle, creeping worry, the kind that comes when two people see the same darkness but disagree about the shape of the figure inside it. Tuppence looked away first. We're close to something, Tommy. I feel it. Or someone wants you to feel that. Before the tension could stretch thinner, a sharp knock shattered it. Not the polite tap of a neighbour, not the firm rap of a caller. A single urgent strike, then nothing. Tommy rose instantly and crossed the room. When he opened the door, the street lay quiet, still, innocently ordinary. No footsteps, no rushing figure, only a faint trace of cologne lingering in the air. Unfamiliar, sharp, almost haunting, and on the doorstep, a white postcard. Tuppence joined him, breath catching as she read the words aloud. He trusted the wrong person. Will you? The words curled through the silence like smoke. Tommy looked at her. This is aimed directly at us. Yes, she whispered. And it's not a warning, it's a test. They stepped inside and closed the door with a soft, final click. The room seemed smaller now, the shadows taller. The case was no longer about Mrs. Larkin, no longer about a ring or a missing man. It was about choices, about loyalty, about trust. And someone out there, someone watching, wanted to see whether Tommy and Tuppence would fracture under the pressure. The night pressed its quiet weight against the windows as the two of them stood side by side, the card lying between them like a dare. The case had become personal, dangerously so. Tuppence had no particular interest in apples that morning, but she found herself examining a pyramid of them at the market with far more attention than the fruit deserved. She was pretending, of course, pretending not to have noticed the man in the long grey coat standing several stalls away, watching her with the stillness of a cat deciding whether to pounce or retreat. The morning bustle clattered and chattered around them, but his eyes remained fixed, dark, uncertain, ringed with a sleepless tension. When she finally lifted her head, he did not look away. Instead, he came toward her. "You shouldn't be here," he said quietly, as though they were old acquaintances meeting in a confessional rather than a marketplace. His voice was strained, the kind of strain born from too many thoughts moving too quickly inside one mind. "You and your husband, stop now, before it's too late." Tuppence raised an eyebrow. "Good morning to you too. Care for an apple? They're terribly earnest today." The attempt at humour bounced off him like a pebble thrown at a fortress wall. His gaze flicked to the wedding ring she held, the one linked to Arthur Larkin and the mysterious initials AM. He paled. "You found it," he whispered, as though she had unearthed a grave rather than a piece of jewellery. "Found is a generous word," Tuppence replied. "It arrived, like a gift, or a warning." The man swallowed hard. "Return it. Forget all of this. Nothing good comes from chasing ghosts, especially mine." "Yours?" she asked sharply. "Are you saying the ring belonged to you?" He hesitated, too long, too noticeably, and stepped back. "I can't help you. Not safely. I only came to— No. I've said too much already." "And yet you've said nothing at all," Tuppence countered. His eyes darted to the edges of the market as if checking for watchers. "You're digging into lives that barely survived being broken once. If you keep going, they won't survive it a second time." Before she could push further, he turned abruptly and walked away, not running, but moving with the deliberate quickness of a man used to disappearing before questions could reach him. Tuppence did not follow. Tommy did. He spotted the grey coat slipping through the market's exit and merged into the flow of pedestrians. The man walked with a slight limp, almost imperceptible unless one watched for it. Tommy kept a polite distance, letting the crowd cloak his movements. The man's pace never faltered, yet he glanced behind him twice, sharp, wary checks that revealed training or long habit. They moved through residential streets where terraced houses stood shoulder to shoulder like gossiping matrons. The man cut across a narrow lane, then another, weaving through quieter paths. Tommy kept up, unwilling to lose him, and equally unwilling to be spotted too soon. Finally, the man turned toward an old boarding house, a structure that seemed to sigh beneath its own age. The paint had peeled away in strips. The windows were clouded with years of neglect. The front door hung crookedly, as though the house welcomed no one and preferred it that way. The grey-coated figure slipped inside. Tommy waited a respectable minute. Then he followed. The air inside was cold, dust-filled, carrying the faintest hint of old tobacco and something chemical, perhaps cleaning fluid, though no one appeared to have cleaned the place in years. A floorboard creaked under his shoe in a sound that felt much too loud. Tommy stepped carefully, keeping close to the shadowed walls. "Hello," he tried softly. Silence answered. He checked the front room. Empty. A dining area with broken chairs, the remnants of wallpaper curled like dying parchment. He moved down a narrow corridor painted by shadows. The smell of cologne reached him, faint but distinct, the same Tuppence had described lingering near Mrs. Larkin's back porch. At the corridor's end, he found the burnt match. Still warm. Someone had been there seconds before. Tommy's pulse quickened. He checked the stairs, looked up, but the landing was empty. No footsteps, no movement. Whoever the watcher was, he had vanished again, leaving only that match and the ghost of his cologne. A breadcrumb trail, if one knew how to follow. Tommy pocketed the match. It might matter later. When Tuppence visited Mrs. Larkin later that afternoon, she found the widow seated in her drawing room, hands clasped as though holding an invisible thread of courage. The quiet room smelled faintly of lavender and old paper, comforting scents, though the air around Mrs. Larkin was undeniably tense. "I'm afraid," the widow said as soon as Tuppence entered. "I feel it more each day. Something is coming." Tuppence sat opposite her. "Mrs. Larkin, earlier we found something in your husband's study. Letters, references to someone named Andrew Marsden. Arthur seemed desperate to locate him." The effect was immediate. Mrs. Larkin's composure crumpled. Tears welled and she pressed a handkerchief to her eyes. "I didn't know how to tell you," she whispered. Arthur carried guilt, a heavy one, something involving Andrew. He never explained, only that he had failed him once and feared he might have failed him again. Tuppence leaned forward gently. Anne mentioned nothing of this. Anne hated that man, Mrs. Larkin murmured. She thought Andrew was a bad influence on her father, that he stirred up memories better left buried. She never forgave Arthur for caring so deeply about anyone other than family, especially after her mother died. Tuppence felt a tightening in her chest. Not fear, but recognition. Families could twist themselves into knots tighter than any mystery. "Do you think," Tuppence asked softly, "that these recent disturbances are connected to Andrew Marsden?" Mrs. Larkin hesitated. "Arthur believed Andrew died years ago, a terrible accident during the war, but I sometimes wondered, there were rumours, whispers, that he survived, that he was terribly injured. Arthur searched, but he never found him." Tuppence's heart quickened. A man who was supposed to be dead, a man Anne despised, a man connected by initials to a wedding ring engraved with devotion. Everything was beginning to align, too neatly. She left the cottage with a mixture of sympathy and sharpened urgency. Tommy was waiting for her at the corner, hands in pockets, expression unreadably calm. "Well?" she asked. He handed her the burnt match. "Our watcher's calling card." Tuppence looked from the match to Tommy. "So he followed you too?" "He didn't follow." Tommy's voice was low. "He vanished. No one moves like that unless they've had practice." They walked together in silence for a time. The late afternoon held a strange weight, not oppressively dark but heavy with unspoken things. Finally, Tuppence broke the quiet. "Tommy, there's something you're not saying." "And you," he replied gently, "are charging ahead without thinking." They stopped walking. A rare tension flared between them, unfamiliar and unwelcome. "You think I'm being reckless," she said. "I think," he answered, "we're being fed pieces of a puzzle by someone who knows exactly how we'll respond, someone who may not have our best interests at heart." Tuppence stiffened. "And you think I'm falling for it?" "I think you're brilliant," he said softly. "But brilliance can still be manipulated." The honesty struck more deeply than any accusation. She looked away, jaw tightening. "And you," she countered, "are being cautious to the point of blindness. Whoever that man is, he knows something vital, something about Arthur, about Andrew Marsden, and he's frightened. That tells me we're close." Their eyes met. Frustration, affection, fear, all tangled. They were not enemies, but they were no longer aligned. Before either could speak again, a figure across the street paused, a silhouette in a coat too familiar to mistake. The grey coat, watching, always watching. When Tuppence blinked, he was gone. Gone so quickly it felt like a warning. The shadows around their case had lengthened, and for the first time they were not standing in the same light. The silence between Tommy and Tuppence that morning was the kind most couples dread. Not sharp, not explosive, but the cool, careful quiet of two people determined not to say the wrong thing before they understood what they truly felt. They dressed without comment. They prepared tea without remark. And then, almost absurdly in sync, they both reached for the same coat at the same time. "You take it," Tuppence said, with a brightness too smooth to be trusted. "No, go on," Tommy replied, equally false. They dropped the coat together and stood in an awkward truce until Tuppence released a breath. "We're being ridiculous." "Yes," Tommy agreed. "Professionally ridiculous." "Personally ridiculous is worse," she muttered, but the faint thaw in her tone was enough to bridge the divide. They set off arm in arm, perhaps more for symbolism than comfort, to visit Arthur Larkin's former solicitor. The solicitor's office in Bloomsbury was the kind of place where dust motes seemed to float in permanent tenancy. Mr. Whitcomb, an elderly man with sparse white hair and spectacles that enlarged his eyes, peered at them as though they were curiosities in a shop window. "Arthur Larkin," he repeated, folding his hands with care. "A reserved gentleman, methodical, honest, mostly. What is it you wish to know?" "Anything pertaining to his last months," Tuppence said gently, "particularly if he entrusted you with concerns or instructions he did not share with his family." Whitcomb hesitated long enough to confirm the direction of their suspicions. Mr. Larkin did draft a letter shortly before he passed. A letter of considerable emotional weight, I might add. To whom? Tommy asked. I cannot say. The old solicitor gestured toward a drawer but did not open it. He sealed it himself and left no address, only initials. A.M.? Tuppence asked quietly. Whitcomb's eyes flickered, just once, but it was enough. You do not miss much, Mrs. Beresford. He did open the drawer then, extracting a cream envelope with a wax seal still unbroken. Upon its front were the initials, written in a steady, deliberate hand, A.M. Tuppence studied it with reverence. What was the content? I never read it. Whitcomb sighed. Arthur died before he could instruct me further. Without an addressee, I had no authority to deliver it. Tommy exchanged a glance with Tuppence, one of those deep, wordless looks built over years of partnership. Did Arthur mention Andrew Marsden? Tommy asked. Whitcomb looked startled. Only once. He said he was searching for him. I assumed it was about an old military matter. A pause. There was also an argument. Between Arthur and his daughter, Tuppence pressed. Yes, on the morning of his stroke. She came here afterward, distressed and angry. I gathered she had learned her father intended to adjust the will in favour of his second wife. Which Anne resented, Tuppence murmured. Whitcomb nodded. I believe she carried more resentment than she ever admitted. They thanked the solicitor and stepped back into the bustling street, each absorbed in the implications. Anne had motive to hide things, Tommy said thoughtfully. And fear, Tuppence added. Fear is often a better motive than greed. Their next destination was a rehabilitation home on the outskirts of London, once the resting place for veterans Arthur Larkin had quietly supported. The facility was peaceful, its halls lined with framed sketches drawn by former residents, hands unsteady but hearts steady. A nurse with auburn hair greeted them. May I help you? We're looking for information about Andrew Marsden, Tuppence said, or anyone who might have known him. The nurse's brow furrowed. Marsden? Yes, a quiet fellow. A terrible case. Terrible. She glanced around, lowering her voice. He survived an explosion, in body, not in spirit, partially disfigured. He had a friend who visited often, a man in a grey coat. Tuppence leaned forward. A grey coat? Yes, tallish, kept to himself. They argued sometimes, but there was affection there. Then suddenly the visitor stopped coming. Marsden deteriorated after that. Did Marsden die here? Tommy asked carefully. The nurse hesitated. His name disappeared from the register. One day he was simply gone. No forwarding address, no paperwork, no record of discharge. She shivered. The kind of disappearance that keeps one awake. Tommy and Tuppence withdrew into a quiet corner of the corridor. If Marsden lived, Tuppence whispered, why hide? And why reach out to us? And who helped him disappear? Tommy added. Arthur? Anne? Someone else? The questions multiplied like shadows at twilight. By late afternoon, they returned home with the strange feeling that answers were gathering just beyond reach. Tuppence fumbled for her keys, but the door creaked open at her touch. Tommy's hand went to her arm. Stay behind me. Their office was still, the dust motes undisturbed, the chairs exactly where they had left them. No broken locks, no rummaged drawers, nothing amiss except for the single object placed neatly on the desk. Arthur Larkin's missing pamphlet, the very one absent from his study. It lay there as though politely delivered by someone too courteous for burglary, but too bold for anonymity. Tuppence approached it slowly. Tommy scanned the windows and corners. No one is hiding, he murmured. They don't need to hide, Tuppence said. They want us to see this. She lifted the pamphlet with care. On the back, faint fingerprints smudged the surface, not quite clear enough to identify, but distinct enough to feel deliberate. A message without words. Something rustled outside, the faintest scrape of shoe leather on pavement. Tommy darted to the window, but the passerby was ordinary, a woman with a pram. Not them, he muttered. Someone wants us following a particular trail, Tuppence said, and they're neither subtle nor shy about it. Or they're growing impatient. She closed the pamphlet and looked at him, truly looked at him, past the day's strain and the undercurrent of tension. Tommy, she began. Yes? His voice was softer now. We mustn't let the case do what it's trying to do. His brows knitted. Which is? Divide us. Her hand brushed his. "Whoever is moving these pieces understands how to create doubt." Tommy tightened his grip. "Then we stay ahead of them." "For that," she murmured, "we have to be together." He nodded. A quiet understanding settled between them, warmer than the moment that morning, more certain. But the moment passed quickly. Cases did not wait for romance. "We need to follow the lead," Tuppence said, straightening. "Arthur's pamphlet must connect to AM." "And someone wants us to see it now," Tommy added. Their gazes met once more, this time united, steady, resolute, together or apart. Someone intended to force the choice. But tonight, at least, Tommy and Tuppence would face the darkness side by side. They extinguished the lights, locked the door, and stepped into the night with a renewed sense of purpose, and the faint, unsettling awareness that each step forward meant stepping deeper into someone else's design, and that someone was not finished with them yet. Tuppence held the pamphlet as though it were a volatile chemical. The thin pages fluttered in her hand every time she breathed, and the small living room felt unbearably still as she and Tommy sat opposite each other. Their earlier argument lingered in the air like residual smoke, unspoken but thick, as though neither wished to stir it again. "Look here," Tuppence murmured, smoothing the page. Arthur's pencil circles stood out, precise, almost obsessive. One phrase was marked twice. "A soldier owes his comrades the truth, even when silence seems kinder." "That," she said softly, "is practically identical to the postcard wording." Tommy nodded, leaning forward, elbows on his knees. "So either our mysterious correspondent is quoting Arthur, or quoting the same text he was obsessed with." "And these notes," she said, turning the next page, "match some of the other messages. Restitution, honor in error. They're not random, they're breadcrumbs." "Breadcrumbs to what?" Tommy asked. Tuppence lifted her eyes. "To Andrew Marsden." The name hovered in the space between them, a spectre newly awake. Tommy rubbed his jaw, thoughtful. "If Marsden survived that explosion, then Arthur knew," Tuppence interrupted, "and someone didn't want anyone else to know." The pamphlet rustled again as she closed it. "Time for a visit. Anne Larkin has been dancing around the truth for far too long." Anne was not pleased to see them. Her father's old country home sat at the end of a long gravel drive. The hedges trimmed to within an inch of their lives, the entire property radiating a sort of brittle perfection that suggested constant vigilance. She opened the door wearing a guarded expression. "I warned you both," she said, arms folded. "My family's business is private." "Then you should have kept it tidy," Tuppence replied, stepping through the doorway without waiting for permission. Tommy followed, apologetic but determined. Anne's composure wavered. "I've said everything I know." Tuppence set the pamphlet on a nearby table with a deliberate thud. "Then let's discuss this. Arthur Larkin made notes, detailed, emotional notes, about honour, guilt, and a comrade he believed he'd wronged. A comrade whose initials matched the ring Tuppence found in our office drawer, and whose name we now know." Anne's eyes flickered. Tommy continued, voice gentle. "Andrew Marsden. Arthur tried to locate him shortly before his death. He filed an official request." For a heartbeat, Anne's mask held. Then it cracked. Her shoulders sagged. Her breath left her in a shudder. "I told him not to keep looking," she whispered. "I told him it would only hurt Mother more." Tuppence's instincts sharpened. Why would it hurt her? Anne closed her eyes. "Because Marsden was more than a comrade. They were inseparable as boys. My father blamed himself for what happened during the war, for a report filed incorrectly, one that led to Marsden being declared missing and assumed dead. Father always said he failed a friend." She swallowed. "I thought he'd never heal. And when he started trying to find Marsden again, just before he died, he was unraveling. I thought if he dug up the past, it would kill him." "But he died anyway," Tuppence said softly. Anne nodded, silent tears forming. Tommy stepped closer, expression gentle. "Anne, the man in the grey coat. You spoke to him, didn't you?" Her silence was answer enough. "He approached me," she whispered. "Weeks ago. He said Father owed him the truth, and if I didn't reveal everything, someone else would. He frightened me. I thought if I pushed suspicion towards stepmother, he'd stop bothering me." Tuppence's voice was cool. You let us think Mrs. Larkin might be the reason someone was breaking into her home. Anne winced. I only wanted to protect my family. And Marsden? Tommy asked. Is he alive? The question broke the last of Anne's resistance. She sank onto a velvet chair, fingers trembling. Yes, she said. He's alive. Tuppence exhaled sharply, half triumph, half dread. Anne continued. He wrote to father once, years after the explosion. He said he bore no hatred toward him, but that the army would never clear his record. His face was badly damaged. He couldn't bear to appear before people who knew him. He said he lived quietly, alone. She looked up miserably. I burned the letter. Tuppence's fury sparked. You destroyed evidence of a man your father loved like a brother? I was afraid, Anne cried. Afraid father would chase ghosts until he destroyed himself. And when he died before finishing that search, I just wanted the past to stay buried. But Marsden didn't, Tuppence said. And now, Anne whispered, he's haunting all of us. Outside, the air carried a brittle quiet, the sort that arrived after confessions too heavy for any room to contain. Tommy and Tuppence walked side by side toward their car. Well, Tommy said at last, we know Marsden is alive. And watching, Tuppence added. She thought of the man's eyes, haunted, sharp, flickering with recognition at the ring. He wanted us to know the truth, but slowly, carefully. He was guiding us, not attacking us. Guiding? Tommy stopped, incredulous. By breaking into a widow's home, leaving cryptic notes, following us across London? Not violence, she replied. Pressure. He wants the truth revealed, but he's terrified of being seen. Tommy frowned. But why put that kind of strain on Mrs. Larkin, or on us? Tuppence hesitated. Then, because he's afraid of us making the same mistake Arthur made. What mistake? Choosing the wrong person to trust. Tommy looked away, jaw tightening. Their earlier argument pulsed back into his mind, his doubt, her frustration. Surely he doesn't think. He sees us arguing, Tuppence murmured. He sees us pulling in opposite directions. Maybe he thinks it's happening again. Tommy exhaled slowly. A romantic notion, or a paranoid one. Trauma makes odd philosophers, Tuppence replied. Tommy gave a small, reluctant smile. That it does. Back home, they spread the pamphlet, Anne's confession, and the earlier clues across the kitchen table. The soft yellow lamp cast an intimate glow over the evidence, a contrast to the gravity of the revelations. Tuppence paced, arms crossed. Arthur and Marsden were involved in something during the war. A misfiled report, yes, but it must have been more than that. Tommy sifted through documents. Look at the dates. Arthur's request to find Marsden was filed 3 months before his death, and the first postcard to Mrs. Larkin appeared 2 months ago. Which means Marsden returned to London only recently. Tuppence paused. Or someone returned in his name. Tommy looked up sharply. You think someone else is orchestrating this? Possibly, but the man in the grey coat, he reacted to the ring. That was genuine. And he knew Anne, Tommy added. He approached her directly. Tuppence's voice softened. He's fragile, Tommy, and frightened, but determined. Tommy leaned back. Which leaves one question. What is he waiting for? Tuppence stopped pacing. For us to reach him. The room stilled. It was a simple answer, and a daunting one. We confront him, she said. We find where he's gone. Tommy nodded. The boarding house. And anywhere else he might return to, she added. Places tied to Arthur. Old haunts. Familiar memories. Tommy gathered the papers. Then in the morning, we begin tracking Marsden properly. No more shadows. But Tuppence wasn't listening. She was staring at the window. Not at the night beyond it, but at the small brick sill. A white rectangle sat neatly there. Tommy followed her gaze, dread rising. He crossed the room, opened the window and retrieved the object. A postcard. Fresh, unsmudged. He turned it over. Some truths must be claimed before they are stolen. Tuppence swallowed. He's close. Too close, Tommy murmured. Their eyes met. The case didn't simply touch their lives now. It had stepped inside. The abandoned boarding house loomed ahead of them like something caught between life and collapse, a structure that had once known purpose but now stood in a long twilight of decay. Tommy paused at the gate, studying the flaking paint, the shutter hanging crookedly from a rusted hinge, and the faint sag in the roofline that made the house appear as though it were bowing under the weight of its secrets. Tuppence, standing beside him with her gloved hands clasped tightly, exhaled a single determined breath. "Well," she murmured, "if ever a place promised revelations, it is this charming specimen of disrepair." Tommy offered a wry smile. "Let's just hope its occupants aren't of the furry whiskered variety." The front door resisted at first, as though reluctant to let visitors enter after years of neglect. Tommy pushed harder, and the swollen wood gave way with a groan that echoed across the hollow interior. A smell drifted out, stale air, dust, and something faintly metallic, like old tools left to rust in the dark. Tuppence stepped in first, her posture straightening as her eyes took in the dim hallway with its peeling wallpaper and a threadbare runner that had once, perhaps, been green. A floorboard creaked somewhere deeper in the house, not with the skittering weight of an animal, but something heavier, human. Tuppence turned her head sharply, and Tommy felt the old familiar tug of nerves low in his stomach. "It could be the wind," he whispered. "It could," she agreed, "but it isn't." Anne's directions had been clear. Top floor, far end, attic room. The man in the grey coat had chosen his hiding place with care, selecting a location that felt outside normal time, a place where people were unlikely to intrude, where shadows could stretch without interruption. The corridor ahead stretched long and narrow, the doors on either side shut tight like mouths locked against confession. They moved slowly, every step releasing a muted puff of dust. On the left, a room lay open, a bed frame without a mattress, a cracked mirror, a washstand leaning sideways. Tommy paused, listening, but the house offered only silence, a silence that felt watchful. "Tommy," Tuppence whispered, "look." At the end of the hallway, a faint, thin line of light glowed beneath a closed door. Not bright, but steady, the unmistakable sign of an occupied room. They approached it with controlled breaths. Tommy reached the door first, resting his hand gently on the knob. Before he could turn it, a voice drifted through the wood, low and tremulous. "You needn't knock," it said. "I've been waiting." The sound of it, thin, strained, fragile, sent a ripple down Tommy's spine. He exchanged a look with Tuppence. Yes, this was the moment. He turned the knob. The attic room was larger than expected, its pitched ceilings sloping to meet the walls like folded wings. A single lamp on a rickety table cast a pool of warm light into the otherwise shadowy space. Dust particles drifted through the beam like slow-moving stars, and in the center of it sat a man with his back to them. He was hunched forward slightly in a wooden chair, hands resting on his knees. His coat, the long grey one they had seen before, hung loosely around his shoulders as though he had lost weight he could not spare. Tommy cleared his throat cautiously. "We've been looking for you." The man chuckled softly, though there was no humour in it. "Of course you have. I left enough breadcrumbs." Tuppence stepped further into the light, her voice calm but sharp. "You've watched us, followed us, left notes, moved objects in a grieving woman's home. That is not the behaviour of a man seeking peaceful closure." "I never claimed I sought peace," the man replied quietly. "Then what do you seek?" Tommy asked. "A reckoning." He shifted, and for a moment Tommy thought he would turn, but instead the man ran a hand through his uneven hair, fingers trembling. Tuppence noticed. She also noticed the faint scent of cologne lingering in the room, the same scent from Mrs. Larkin's back porch. That small confirmation tightened her gaze. "You've been guiding us," she said softly, "or perhaps testing us." "Both," he murmured. Tuppence took another step. "Why not speak directly? Why the postcards? Why torment Mrs. Larkin?" At that, the man stiffened. His voice, when it came, felt scraped raw. "Torment? No. Remind, yes. Remind her of truths long buried. Remind her of loyalty betrayed. Remind her of the cost." Tommy frowned. "Cost of what?" The chair creaked as the man finally rose. He did so slowly, as though the action required more effort than it should. When he turned, the light fell across his face, and Tuppence inhaled sharply. Half of it remained intact, a man of perhaps 50, lined by hardship but not unkind. But the other half, scar tissue ran from temple to jaw, puckered and uneven, as though his skin had melted and refrozen into a map of suffering. His left cheek bore the worst of it, the flesh twisted inward. The damage pulled slightly at his mouth, giving him a solemn, asymmetrical expression. "I am Andrew Marsden," he said quietly, a name most believed ended in a crater years ago. Silence hung in the room like a held breath. Tommy spoke first. "You're alive." Marsden nodded once. "Alive, yes. Whole, no, but surviving all the same." Tuppence, recovering from her initial shock, asked gently, "Why come to us?" "Because Arthur trusted you," Marsden replied, voice trembling slightly. "He spoke of you in his letters, said you were a pair who valued truth over convenience, fairness over gossip. He hoped," his voice caught, "he hoped someone would find the truth after he was gone." Tuppence swallowed. "He never stopped searching for you." "No," Marsden said, eyes glistening. "But Anne did everything she could to stop him. She believed the scandal would ruin them all. She hid the report. She silenced what she could. And Arthur, guilt-ridden, desperate, kept writing letters he couldn't bear to send." Tommy exhaled slowly. "He blamed himself for what happened to you." "He should have," Marsden's tone hardened. "He misfiled that report. Carelessness, perhaps. A mistake. But that mistake cost me my name, my career, my face." He touched the scarred side gently, "and my life as I knew it." "But you forgave him," Tuppence said. It wasn't a question. Marsden closed his eyes. When he opened them, they held a depth of weary resignation. "I forgave the man, but I could not forgive the silence, the secrecy, the cowardice that followed." Tommy stepped closer. "Then why all the theatrics, the postcards, the ring, the rearranged objects?" Marsden's gaze turned toward them sharply. "Because truth requires discomfort. Pressure forces revelation. Arthur once chose the wrong person to trust. I needed to know if you would do the same." Tuppence stiffened. "You were testing our loyalty?" "I was testing your clarity," Marsden corrected. "You are a team, or at least you were." His eyes flicked pointedly between them. "But this case, it has already driven a wedge. Doubt has crept in." Tommy and Tuppence exchanged a glance, one filled with the unspoken tension that had grown between them in recent days. Marsden saw it. "You see, pressure reveals the cracks. I feared you might crumble. I feared you might turn on each other, just as Arthur and I once did." Tuppence's voice was softer now. "Why bring us here? Why now?" Marsden stepped back into the circle of lamplight. "Because the truth is ready, and so must you be. What comes next requires unity, not suspicion." He reached into his coat and withdrew a folded, yellowed letter. He placed it on the small table between them. "Arthur's final confession," he said. "Unsent, unspoken, but not forgotten." Tommy stared at it, throat tightening. "Why give it to us?" "Because someone must finish what Arthur began," Marsden whispered. "Someone must confront Anne. Someone must ensure the truth is not buried again." Tuppence nodded slowly. "We will." Marsden watched them with a weary, almost paternal sadness. "See that you do, and see that you do it together. Loyalty is a fragile thing, Mr. and Mrs. Beresford. Easier to break than bones, harder to mend than pride." The lamp flickered slightly, throwing shifting shadows across the ruined half of his face. "The next step," Marsden said, "will test you more than anything else." And as Tommy and Tuppence absorbed the weight of his words, the air in the attic room felt charged with the gravity of the truth, a truth that had shattered one friendship and was now poised to challenge the very foundation of their marriage. Tommy had not expected silence to feel so heavy. It clung to the three of them, Tommy, Tuppence, and the gaunt shadow that was Andrew Marsden, as they stepped out from the boarding house and into the evening light. The man moved stiffly, as if every step required negotiation with old injuries and older fears, but he did not hesitate. Whatever lay ahead would at last confront the years he had spent in hiding. "We'll take the quieter streets," Tommy said gently. Marsden nodded. "I've avoided this moment for too long. Tuppence remained close, occasionally glancing at him with an expression that was half compassion, half fierce determination. Her anger now had a focus, not suspicion, not frustration with Tommy, but outrage at the years of injustice threaded through Arthur Larkin's past. Mrs. Larkin's cottage glowed faintly ahead, warm and deceptively peaceful. A pair of lace curtains stirred in the window. Inside that ordinary home lay the tangled heart of the entire case. Tuppence knocked. No answer. She knocked again. At last the door opened a cautious inch and Mrs. Larkin's lined face appeared, tired but alert. "Oh," she whispered, seeing Tommy and Tuppence, then froze when Marsden stepped into view. Her hand flew to her mouth. "Arthur?" "No," Marsden murmured, "not Arthur. Andrew." She opened the door fully. "Please, come in." Inside, Mrs. Larkin hovered like a woman witnessing a ghost walk through her parlour. Her eyes travelled from Marsden's face to Tommy, then to Tuppence, silently demanding an explanation. Tuppence took her hand. "We found him, or rather, he found us, and he has something he must tell you." Mrs. Larkin sat stiffly in her armchair while Marsden remained standing, as though afraid to disturb the furniture with the gravity of his story. He began quietly. "Arthur and I served together. He was the closest friend I ever had. But during a mission, a report was misfiled, an error that placed blame on me." His voice trembled. "I was badly injured shortly afterward in an explosion. Everyone assumed I was dead. Arthur, he believed he had destroyed my life." Mrs. Larkin's eyes softened. "He always carried a sadness he wouldn't name." Marsden nodded. "I forgave him long before he ever knew I lived. But when he finally learned I had survived, he tried to find me. He spent years searching." Tuppence leaned forward. "And someone stopped him." Mrs. Larkin closed her eyes as though bracing for a storm she had always expected, but dreaded hearing aloud. The sitting-room door swung open sharply. Anne Larkin stood in the doorway, pale as chalk. "You shouldn't have brought him here." Tommy stepped instinctively toward her. "Anne, no!" She pointed a trembling hand at Marsden. "I did what had to be done. Father would have been torn apart publicly if the truth came out. His reputation, his work, everything would have been ruined." "Anne," Mrs. Larkin whispered, horrified. "What have you done?" Anne's voice cracked. "I didn't hurt anyone. I only suppressed the file. I intercepted Father's attempts to correct the report. I hid letters he wrote. I thought I was protecting him." Marsden exhaled, shoulders sagging. "And you condemned me to being a ghost." Tuppence's eyes burned with restrained fury. "You had no right." Anne looked between them, at Marsden's ruined face, at Mrs. Larkin's grief, at the silent accusation in Tuppence's gaze, and something within her seemed to break. If the truth had come out, Father would have died in disgrace. Tommy stepped forward. He died carrying guilt he shouldn't have carried alone. Anne stumbled backward. I can't do this." Her hand groped behind her and closed around a slim, leather-bound folder lying on the table. Tommy's stomach lurched. He recognized it instantly. The military file, the original report, the key to clearing Marsden's name. "Anne, leave that," he warned. But she clutched it to her chest and bolted for the hallway. Tuppence was after her in a heartbeat. "Tommy, front door." Tommy sprinted through the kitchen and flung open the back door just as Anne darted out the gate, the folder pressed under her arm. She ran like a woman fleeing judgment itself. Tuppence leapt onto a bicycle leaning against the fence. "Go around, cut her off." Tommy didn't argue. He dashed down the street, heart hammering, lungs burning. Anne tore across the pavement, weaving between startled pedestrians. Her breath came in ragged bursts, but she didn't slow. Tuppence pedalled furiously alongside the street, her tyres skimming puddles left from yesterday's watering of gardens. "Anne, stop! We're not here to ruin you." "I can't," Anne cried, pushing harder. The chase spilled into the suburban high street. A vendor shouted as Anne dodged past his cart. Tommy nearly collided with a lamppost but pushed on, refusing to lose her. Ahead, the railway station rose, quiet, almost deserted at this hour. Anne ran for it. Tuppence shouted, "Tommy! She's heading for the platform!" He gathered the last of his strength, sprinting through the entrance and down the tiled corridor. A single porter looked up in surprise as they passed. Anne reached the platform and skidded to a halt near the edge. The rails glimmered faintly. A distant rumble hinted at a coming train. Tommy slowed, raising his hands gently. "Anne, don't go any farther." She clutched the file tighter. "If this comes out, everything Father built will be tainted." Tuppence arrived beside Tommy, breathless but steady. "Anne, listen to me. Protecting someone you love is noble until it harms someone else. Arthur wanted the truth. He tried to fix it. He wanted Andrew to know." Anne shook her head violently. Tears streamed down her cheeks. "He never said. He never." Mrs. Larkin's voice carried down the platform, thin but resolute. "Because he was ashamed, Anne." Everyone turned. She had followed them, Marsden supporting her arm. The widow's face was calm now. Painfully, beautifully calm. "Arthur regretted what happened," she said softly. "But he regretted even more that he let pride and fear keep him from making it right. He was trying. He asked me to trust him." Anne's grip loosened on the file. "I thought I was doing what he would want." Marsden stepped forward. "He wanted peace." Anne let out a shuddering sob and held the file out with trembling hands. Tommy took it gently. "It's over." Anne sagged to the ground. Tuppence knelt beside her, placing a warm hand on her shoulder. "No more running." Tommy opened the file slowly. Inside lay the truth everyone had suffered for. Arthur's own handwritten confession, never submitted, never witnessed, but clear as daylight. The misfiled report, the responsibility he believed he bore, the friend he thought he had destroyed. Marsden took the pages as though receiving a fragile relic. His fingers shook. His eyes traced Arthur's words, absorbing proof of loyalty that had survived even the grave. When he finished, he pressed the papers to his chest, not in triumph, never triumph, but in quiet, aching closure. Mrs. Larkin whispered, "Andrew, he never stopped loving you as a friend. Never." Marsden bowed his head. "I know that now." Tommy stepped back, giving the moment space. He felt Tuppence rise beside him. They exchanged a glance heavy with understanding, of guilt, of relief, of the hard road they'd walked to reach this fragile peace. Tuppence murmured, "We very nearly lost ourselves in this." Tommy reached for her hand. "But we didn't." That simple truth, so often assumed, so rarely spoken, bound them closer than any victory over clues or suspects ever had. Anne wiped her eyes. "What happens now?" Tuppence answered gently. "The truth, all of it. And then, healing." Marsden looked up, meeting Anne's gaze with a steadiness that surprised them all. "I don't hate you." Anne blinked. "Why?" "Because you loved him," he said, "just as I did." The railway platform seemed to exhale. A train thundered past without stopping, its wind tugging at their clothes, scattering loose sheets in Tommy's hands. He caught them quickly, holding the truth firmly. When the noise faded, silence returned, but it was no longer heavy. It was new, clean, wounded, but hopeful. Tommy closed the file and tucked it under his arm. "Let's go home." Tuppence slipped her arm around his. "Together?" "Always," he said, and this time he meant it with every fibre of himself. Peace returned slowly, like a house settling after a long, sleepless night. For days the Beresfords moved through their routines with a gentler quiet, the sort born from storms endured rather than avoided. Tommy found himself tidying stray papers without prompting, and Tuppence, normally keen to leap into the next adventure, lingered over her morning tea as though relearning the feel of stillness. The case had left its fingerprints on them both. Andrew Marsden, meanwhile, began the delicate business of reclaiming a life he had believed lost. Veteran charities stepped in quickly. Arrangements were made with a diligence that seemed, in a strange way, like penance offered on behalf of a world that had wounded him too deeply. Tuppence watched him leave for the rehabilitation home one morning, standing straight despite his unsteady gait. His scarred face remained half-turned from the daylight, but there had been something new that morning, a cautious flicker of hope. Mrs. Larkin found her own peace in small, determined gestures. She polished Arthur's photograph frames until they shone, but no longer with the manic care of someone warding off fear. Instead, there was a softness about her now, as though she were tending the memory of a man she could forgive again. She welcomed Anne into the cottage one quiet afternoon, and though the visit was brief, its significance was unmistakable. Anne left with reddened eyes and a restored sense of duty, one she now extended toward Andrew Marsden as well, offering to support his recovery with the tentative earnestness of someone trying to undo years of silence. For Tommy and Tuppence, calm re-entered their home as a guest uncertain of its welcome. Their rare quarrel, brief though it had been, had shaken them precisely because their partnership was usually so seamless. Tuppence confronted the memory of it first. "I should have listened more," she said one evening, standing at the kitchen counter with a tea towel draped over her shoulder. "You weren't wrong to worry." Tommy looked up from the drawer he was reorganizing, again, and shook his head. "I wasn't worried about the case. I was worried about you. And then I let that worry turn into doubt. That wasn't fair." "It wasn't unfair." Tuppence's voice softened. "We were both frightened, if only because the stakes stopped being about Mrs. Larkin and her intruder. They became about what secrets can do to people." "Secrets," Tommy said quietly, "and trust." Tuppence slipped her arms around him then, resting her forehead against his cheek for a moment. "Well, trust won in the end. That should count for something." "It counts for everything," Tommy replied. The ring, the catalyst of half their troubles, came back into their hands on a morning edged with pale sunlight. Tuppence held it delicately, studying the engraving with a fresh lens. A.M. To my one true friend. Loyalty, regret, forgiveness, and the unexpected power of being remembered by someone who mattered. It was no ordinary trinket. It was a story compressed into gold. Marsden received it with a stillness that spoke volumes. He did not place it on his finger. Instead, he closed his hand around it slowly, reverently. "Arthur kept this safe," Tuppence told him. "Even when he couldn't find you, he kept faith." Marsden nodded once, the gesture jerky with emotion. "Then I'll keep it safe now, for both of us." The Beresfords left him with the sense that a long broken circle had finally closed. Later that week, Tuppence announced, with her familiar decisive energy, that it was time to rebuild the office drawer system from scratch. Tommy had agreed before his survival instincts could intervene. He was determined to demonstrate that unity meant more than affection. It meant participation. They emptied all 12 drawers onto the carpet, creating unholy piles of faded receipts, stray hairpins, blunt pencils, and a ticket stub from a play neither of them even remembered attending. Tommy paced the chaos like a general surveying enemy lines. "We can't possibly need all of this," he declared. "No," Tuppence agreed, hands on hips, "but we do need a system, one that doesn't lead to surprise wedding rings turning up among the rubber bands." "The next mysterious object," Tommy said gravely, "will be logged, categorized, and placed in the correct drawer." Tuppence's eyes sparkled. "Will it now?" "I'll handle the drawer myself," Tommy added, chest puffed with solemn nobility. Tuppence dropped into a chair, laughing. "Tommy, that is the clearest evidence of love I've ever seen." He grinned despite himself. "Better than flowers? Far better. Flowers wilt. Systems endure." They continued sorting, trading playful remarks as order gradually restored itself. Tommy found himself genuinely committed to the project, not out of duty, but because he understood the symbolism. Their partnership thrived when they met in the middle, when each allowed the other's instincts to shape the path forward. As the afternoon wore on, the piles diminished. Tuppence held up an old fountain pen she didn't recognize. Tommy discovered a diary page written in his own handwriting that he could not, for the life of him, explain. They made jokes about labeling a drawer simply oddities that will become future cases, though they both knew such a drawer would never remain closed for long. When the last few items were finally arranged, Tuppence stepped back, surveying their handiwork with a satisfied sigh. "Well," she said, "we're officially prepared for anything now." Tommy slipped an arm around her waist. "Anything except another mystery involving missing furniture footprints. I think I've had my fill of those for a month." Tuppence arched an eyebrow. "A month? How optimistic." He laughed, feeling lighter than he had in days. "All right, a week." She leaned her head against his shoulder. "Whatever comes next, we'll face it together. Properly together." Their office door stood open to the mild afternoon, letting in the hum of the street below, the distant rattle of a pram, a boy calling to his dog, the rhythmic clack of a baker stacking trays. Ordinary sounds, friendly sounds, the kind that anchor people when life has recently threatened to tilt sideways. Tuppence turned toward Tommy with a mischievous glint. "Do you know, I think this case might have been good for us. Tommy blinked. Good? Well, goodish. Character building, marriage strengthening, draw organizing. He shook his head with affectionate disbelief. Only you could call nearly getting killed by family secrets a positive exercise. Not killed, Tuppence corrected, merely jostled and manipulated. That too, but look what we got out of it. He squeezed her hand. I see your point. Their shared laughter floated softly into the room, warm and wholly untroubled. The worst was behind them. The future, whatever shape it took, would be met with the same blend of courage, wit, and unshakable partnership that made the Beresfords who they were. The case that nearly broke their marriage, in truth, became the case that strengthened it, quietly, firmly, irrevocably.